Here on Daf Vavam Beis. Meine Mushos. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Savi di Azloi Atigra. Tigra means a walking stick. And once the Zkanim, the elders, go through the field with a walking stick, we can assume, and that's what the Aniyim assume, there's no more Matnas Aniyim left in the field. They cleaned it all out. Ishlokish, he's not focused on the Tigra, on the walking stick, but rather Likute Bas Likute. There was one group of Aniyim that went through the field. Likute means they collected what was ever in the field, and then another group comes in to see if maybe they could find some more. And once the second group goes by, then the Aniyim Mesiat Das, they give up, they don't have a chance to find anything else. And at that point, it becomes hefty. Now, Rashi gives an example here of a father and a son, and they work together in the field. The father goes first, and the son follows, picking up whatever the father may have left behind. Once they have passed through the field, no one else bothers to glean in that field. Now we get back to the Revi'ah Shniya, the second rain of the rainy season. Rav Papa Omar, Kidei Lahalech B'Shvilei Harishus. Now, in order to appreciate Shvilei Harishus, we go back to a Gemara in Bava Kama, Madaf Pei Aleph. The Gemara there enumerates the 10 takonos that Yoshua instituted when he crossed the Yarden to conquer the land and started after the conquer to divide it up. One of those 10 takonos of Yoshua would provide for those who owned their land, privately owned land, to do something for the benefit of the broader public community. And that was that the public would be allowed to take shortcuts through their land. Normally, that would be Asagas Gvul, that would be Gzela, to go through someone's land without permission. But here, that's the way Yoshua made the takana, that you would be zocher in your part of the field under the condition that these rights would not be yours as a private owner, but rather they would be given over to the public, and the public would be allowed to cut through your fields. And that's a shvil, a shortcut. And this applied only during the summer months, because by then they had already done the asifa and they'd gathered all the grains from the field by the summer months. And shvil rishus means there was rishus that was accepted by the courts for other people to go in. The Omar Mar, Mahalchim kol adam b'shvilei rishus ad shetered Revi'ah Shniya. We're past the summer months now, and the rains are beginning to fall around Cheshvan time. When the second rain comes, at that point, the grains are growing in the fields, and we cannot interfere, even according to the Takana of Yoshua, with those private owners, because the public going through their fields as a shortcut would damage the fields and, of course, the grains that are growing. And this heter of Shvila Rishus would only apply up to the second rain. Once the second rain fell down, that's when the grains are growing from the rains, and it would be damaging to the grains to allow people to tramp through their land. Vaita, more with regard to the second Revi'ah, the second rainfall. Rav Nach Bar Yitzchak Omar, Levayer Pero Shvius. We have halacha of Pero Shvius called Biur. And the mitzvah of Biur obligates the owner of the field at a certain point in time, which we'll try to describe and define, to take out all of the leftover Pero Shvius, to be mavayir them, to take them out of the house. Now, at what moment in time does the chiyuv biur emerge. This is discussed by the Mishnah, and it's based on a drasha, which is called Achikola Chaya Min Asod, which means the following: that you have sfichim that grow in the field during the 7th year, even without you working the field. They just grow naturally. And during the 7th year, the people at large are allowed to come in and take the fruits. However, let's say you have produce that lasted until the Zman Abir. You have it in your house, and the Chaya and the Sada, the animals out in the fields that would normally be eating those specific, yes, relative to each species, are no longer eating them because out in the fields there's nothing left. So that's the end of the period for that species, and that generates a chiyuv biur. Now, with regard to teven, ad mosai nenim v'sarfim b'teven ubekash. So we're talking about stubble. We're talking about teven is called straw, or maybe kash is called stubble. Different words in English, but we're talking about these areas in the field that have straw growing. And as long as the straw is accessible out in the fields to the animals, then whatever straw or stubble you have in the house, you're allowed to benefit from them. And there's no chiyuv of biur. Up until what point are you allowed to benefit from the teven and the kash of shvius? Up until Achetere Revia Shnia, which means the second rainfall. You're now entering into Shminis, the 8th year, and at the beginning of Shminis, once the second rainfall has fallen, then the assumption is that Kala Lachai, as far as Teven and Kash is concerned, there's nothing left out in the fields. My timer, what is the source for this halacha that whatever Kash and Teven grew during the 7th year, now you have to take it out and get rid of it, take it out of your house through biur, once we get to the point of Revia Shnia, the second rainfall. Tifsiv, we derive it from a pasuk, and this pasuk appears in the parsha of Shemitah in Vayikra Chafei, Ulevehemtecha l'chaya asher be'artzecha. And it should be for the animals out in the fields. And the pasuk here is establishing a kind of a hekesh, an analogy between the animals out in the fields and the animals in your house. Or I should say, the animals that are domesticated, that are out in the fields. If you have a particular species, we'll call it species X, and the animals out in the field are still eating from them, is then if you have domesticated animals inside the house, then you're allowed to feed it to them. You're allowed to benefit from shvius and feed your animals that which is royal achilas behema, and you're not chayav in biur. At what point do you chayav in biur? Kola l'chayim in asada. Once the beasts are no longer eating from that species out in the fields, is kalei lebehemtecha min abayis. Then you have to take out of your house, and that's called biur, all of that particular species that was designated for your animals, your domesticated animals in your house. And by the time the Revia Shnia falls, then there's no longer straw out in the fields because the rain converts the straw into, it's no longer edible even for the animals. It apparently becomes manure. So at that point, with the second rain, which is called Revia Shnia, then whatever 7th year teven or kash you have in the house has to be taken out of the house. That's called biur shvius. Now back on Daf Vav Amud Aleph, we always assume that the word revere meant rainfall. Omar Rabbi Avo, my Lashon revere. So what is the etymology and the root of the word revere, that it should mean rainfall? Dover sherovea es hakarka. So the word revere, which is borrowed from a kind of intimacy or a penetration, so the rain penetrates into the ground, and that's called rovea. And in this sense, the noun is revere. Kid Rabbi Yehuda, this reflects the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, the Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Mitra Baila di Arahu. Mitra is rain, matar, from the Hebrew matar, and it's Baila, Baila is Miloshen Poel, the husband, the Ara, into the soil, and the rains penetrate into the soil. We'll see exactly how deep into the soil the rains have to penetrate. And Emar, I'm going to base this on a pasuk in Yeshayahu and Novi, Ki kasher yered hashel ageshem v'ashel min hashamayim. This is the famous chapter Nun-Hey that we read on a Taanit tzibur from Yeshayahu and Novi. When the rain comes down, v'ashel min hashamayim, the snow comes down from the sky, v'shama lo yashuv, and it never returns. I'im nirva es ha'aretz v'olida v'tzmicha. It saturates the earth and makes it bear vegetation. In other words, holy david tmicha means to vegetate, bud. So the word v'holida, which means to give birth, is used in this pasuk, and it hints to a comparison between rain and a husband who causes his wife to bear children. Another further light to be shed on this concept of revere is the statement of Rabbi Avo. The Omer Rabbi Avo, revere rishona, kedei shetered bekarka tefa. It means that with the first rain, the rainwater will only penetrate one tefa, a couple of inches into the soil. Shnia, however, the second rain, kidei lagov ba pi hachavis, the ground becomes so moist, so wet, like mud almost, that you can cover a barrel with it. Amar Rav Chizda, Yeshamim sheyardu, the rains that fell down, kidei laguf bahem pi hachavis. And now Rav Chizda adds another element into the equation. In Kriyat Shema, we have a pasuk that indicates a klala, chas v'sholom, if the Jewish people are not observing the will of God, v'atzares hashamayim, there will be no rains coming down. That's the curse. And Rav Chizda says, once we get to the point where the rains have fallen and they've penetrated into the ground, since the ground is now muddy, you could make out of it some sort of almost a covering of a pi chavis, is ein b'hem mishum v'otzar. We know that we have survived that curse, and it doesn't apply to us, of atzaras hashamayim. The Omer of Chizda, furthermore, Yeshamim sheyardu kodem v'otzar, ein b'hem mishum v'otzar. What we're talking about now is Kriyat Shema. In Kriyat Shema, of course, we recite that curse. We mention it. Now, what we're going to see, I'm just anticipating what's coming down around the bend, that the rains that prove to us, that demonstrate that we're not subject to the curse, we're free of the Otzar Hashamayim, are the rains that come down during the morning, but not during the evening. So he says, Elakoda v'otzar di urta. And we're talking about before the evening. Aval kodem v'otzar ditzafra, if it was before the morning, which means during the evening. So we're talking about two types of rains: rain that fell during the day, as opposed to rain that fell at night. At what point do we know sure that the rains indicate and demonstrate that we're no longer subject, vulnerable to the curse of the otzar? That's only daytime rains. Aval kodem v'otzar ditzafra, if it was a nighttime rain before daybreak, then such a rain is yesh b'hem mitshum v'otzar. We're still exposed to the possible curse of God restraining the rains. The Omer of Yehuda bar Yitzchak, Hani anoni ditzafra, lesbahu mishasha. If there are clouds early in the morning, ditzafra, right? We have something called Amud Shachar, let's say dawn, daybreak. If there are clouds before dawn, then they have no substance, meaning they have no bracha. They do not in any way mitigate the klola. Because we need, as we said before, rains during the day. The night rains are not going to do it. Chsiv, Ma esel lecha Ephraim, and Hosea Novi says, what can I do for you, Ephraim? Ma esel lecha Yehuda, what can I do for you, Yehuda? V'chaz lechem kanan boker. He's sort of like complaining about the so-called chesed of Ephraim and Yehuda, which can be compared to something that has no substance to it, and that is the anan boker. So God is now giving a harsh rebuke through the Navi Hosea to tell Klal Yisrael that their goodness and their so-called chesed is really insubstantial. It's like a cloud before dawn. Amalei Rav Papal Abaye, v'ha Amri Inchi. I have a question on what you just said, because people say that the Miftach Bavei Mitra means that Mitra, of course, is the rain, and Bavei are the gates, and Miftach are the opening in the gates. We're talking about the gates that are opening in the early morning. Bar Chamara Moch Sakach Ugnei, meaning that there's an abundant amount of produce as a result of the rains that fell early in the morning, such that now we tell the donkey driver who wants to gather his grains and sell them in the market that he might as well pack up. He should go back to sleep, because he's not going to be able to compete with the market, because the abundance of produce would just run him out of business. He will not accrue any great success and profit from selling his grains because of the abundance of produce that are brought forth by the rains. We see that pre-dawn rains do bring a blessing, and there's a voluminous increase in produce. Lo kasha, hadakater bi'iva, hadakater ba'noni. When we say that the morning rains can generate an abundant produce, that's talking about a sky that you see in the sky thick clouds, which means that there's an abundance of rain. But when you're talking about the statement that morning rains are insubstantial, that's in a case where you'll see up in the sky thin clouds, very weak potential for rain. And that's not going to have the impact of the thicker clouds that are going to create and generate the produce. Rabbi Yehuda, Tova l'shaita the teves armalata. Now, shata is a year, and tova it's good. It's good for a year. Good sign for the year. If teves is an almana, armalata is an almana. meaning a widow. A widow meaning divorced of the rains that come as we described before, the husband, penetrating the soil. And the question is why? Why is Rabbi Yehuda saying that if Teves has no rainfall, that's a good sign for the year, that's an advantage? And Rashi explains that this will reflect Rabbi Yehuda's statement that we had before, that the relationship of rain to the ground is like a husband to a wife. And if rain doesn't fall, then we could say about the soil that it's widowed. And the Gemara tries to explain why this is so. Why is that a good sign that there's no rain in Teves? According to one approach, to Lobairi Tarbitzi. Now, this is a reference to the Batei Midrashos, where the Talmidei Chacham study Torah and disseminate and transmit Torah. And if there's too much rain during Teves, then the Batei Midrashos are kind of empty. You can't fight against the rain. But if no rain falls in Teves, then it's very easy access to the Batei Midrashos. The roads also are dry, and they're not muddy. They're in good condition, and the Talmidei Chacham are able to travel to the Batei Midrashos. Ika Diamri, according to another explanation, to Lo Shakil Shudfana, which literally means that Shidafon, which is kind of a blight, will not be affected. In other words, the crops normally might be damaged in Teves when they're growing by very heavy rains. But if there are no fierce rains coming down, then we can rely on the crop and it will grow and flourish. So the Gemara objects, Any is the Sov Amrav Chizda, Tava l'shaita the Teves minavlota. This is just the opposite. Tava l'shaita, it's a good sign for the year if Teves is minuval. Nivul means when you are unkempt, like someone who's living on those difficult conditions, you can't take a bath, a shower. It means that the roads are actually muddy. There's an abundance of rain. So we'll have to explain this statement of Rav Chizda in the light of the Gemara's answer as to whether or not it's a good thing for the Jews if Teves is a rainy month or it's a bad thing. Lo kasha. The asa mitra meikara. When we say that we're hoping that Teves will be a dry month without any rain, that's a case where during Mar Cheshvan we had enough rain, we had ample rain. So we get to Teves, there's no need for rain. And on the contrary, rain could be very uncomfortable and challenging for people who want to go down the roads, travel the roads, and get to the Batei Midrashos. Hadalo asa mitra meikara. If there was not enough rain during the month of Cheshvan, then it would be a great advantage if Teves is a wet month and there are plenty of rains. The Omer of Chizda Geshamim sheyardu al miktsas medina. What happens if part of the province, one of the smaller areas, has rain and the other doesn't? Is that a curse? Is that a fulfillment of Lo Yeh Matar Atzechem v'Yatzaras Hashamayim v'Lo Yeh Matar V'Adamah? And Rav Chizda takes the position that Ein B'hem Shum V'Yotza. In other words, as far as that province is concerned, you don't have to have a tremendous crop all over the province. If one part of the province successfully produces what they need, they can supply the rest of the province with that produce. And therefore we know that there's no kiyum to the klala of the Otzas Hashemayim. So the Gemara objects, Eini v'aksiv. What are you going to do with the pasuk in Amos? The Gama Nochi Manati Mimchem Es hageshem, I withhold the rains. Biod shlosha chadashim lekatzir. There are 3 months until the tzira. Vimtarti al ir achas. The curse will be that I'll bring rain on one particular city, but vel ir achas loam, there won't be any rain on the other city. Or chelka achas timotar, one portion will receive rain and the other will not. And the Omer of Yehuda Marav, shteim leklol. In other words, if there's rain, if there's drought in different parts and provinces, that's a curse. And basically what Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rav, is saying, that if you have what's called a partial drought, then the rain itself is actually a klola, because what happens is it damages the crops. Lo kasha hadiasa tuva hadiasa kidamiboy le. And it all depends upon whether or not there's ample rain. So the last statement that says that even partial drought is considered a curse, that's the case where there's too much rain, an excessive amount of rain, and that's going to damage the crops. But the statement of Rav Chisda that we had before, that a partial drought is not a curse, that's where the exact appropriate volume of rain that we need has fallen, but not an excessive amount of rain. And what's going to happen is there's produce growing in one province where there's perfect amount of rain, and they're going to supply whatever they need for the entire province. Omer of Ashi, Dekanami, look at the pasuk, Tichsiv Timoter. The pasuk says Timoter instead of Amtir. Now, what does that mean, Timoter? And the Gemara says, Tehei Makom Motar. What does it mean, Tehei Makom Motar? Be a place for rain. Rashi explains, it will be rain to such an excess that we will describe the area as a place of rain. It's overdoing it, so to speak, overkill. It's got an excessive amount of rain. Shma mina. This is a continuation of a Gemara in Masechet Brachos, Adaf Nun Daled. The Mishnah there formulates a special bracha for the first rain. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hatov ve'hametiv, who is good and does good. That's the Mishnah on Nun Daled. If you fast forward to the Sugis HaGemara Nun Tes, the Gemara mentions that there's a contradiction here, because we have another source that the Nusach HaBracha is Modem Anachulach Hashem Elokeinu al kol tipa v'tipa shel radet lanu, thanking Hashem for every single drop that He has brought down on us. And the Gemara reconciles this apparent contradiction by saying that there's a difference between seeing the rain and hearing the rain. So the blessing of Hatov HaMeitiv applies when you hear the rain, for example, not the actual rain, but you're aware of the fact that the rain is falling. However, there's a more extensive and perhaps profound Shevach HaKadosh Baruch Hu when you actually see the rain, and that's the second source, which says Modem Anachulach, etc. Now, it could be that we never heard of this bracha so much, because the bracha says the Shulchan Aruch is only to be recited when we went through a drought. There were fast days, public distress, and there are certain countries where rain is sparse, and once the first rainfall comes, That's an experience of joy that generates hakaras hatov, gratitude to the Ribono Shalom, and we should recite the bracha. Says Rabbi Avo, me'emasai mevarach al gshamim, mishayetze chason likras kala. And that means that we had this explanation or vision of the rain like a chason coming down to the ground, which is a kala. And what Rabbi Avo seems to indicate here is that when drops of rain fall into, they gather together into a puddle of water, then when the droplets come down from the falling rains from Shamayim, from the sky, they sort of bounce off the puddles of water. And that's considered a bracha, a time for bracha to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm Mavarech. What's the exact nusach HaBracha Matbeah? Mod Amrav Yehuda Marav, Modim Anachnu Lach Hashem Elokeinu, Al Kol Tipa V'Tipa Sharada Lanu. For Rabbi Yochanan Misayim Bahachi, he adds what's called the Shira, which is part of Nishmas, as we recited on Shabbos, right before Birchas Kriyat Shema. Ilu Finu Mole Shira Kayom L'Shonenu Rina Kamon Galov. And we go on until Ad Al Yazvunu Rachamech Hashem Elokeinu V'lo Azavunu Baruch Rov HaHodaos. It sounds like, if you join together the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Marav together with that of Rabbi Yochanan, that there's no actual bracha b'shemu v'malchus. We begin with Modem Anachnu Lach, and we end with Baruch Rov HaHodaos. So first, the Gemara sort of intervenes here by asking the following question: Rov HaHodaos, lo kol HaHodaos. Why are you mentioning only most of the goodness and thanksgiving? Omar Rava Ema, you should rewrite it. Kel HaHodaos, describing God as the God of Hodos. Now, at this point, Rashi says that the Chasimas HaBrachas with Shemu Malchus, Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu Melech Olam, Kel HaHodaos, the God of thanksgiving, meaning all praises due to God. Amar Papa Hilkach, therefore, here we turn to Zayin and Aleph, Nimrininu L'Travaya, we should say both of Kel HaHodaos, V'Rov HaHodaos, Baruch Atah, etc., etc., V'Rov HaHodaos, Kel HaHodaos. And there's something similar that we recite at the end of Yishtaba. El Melech Gadol B'Tishbachos, Kel HaHodaos. And God is the King that's exalted with praise, and God is the King of thanksgivings. And when we add Kel Hodos, then Rov Hodos means a multiplicity of thanksgiving, not most thanksgivings. According to a lot of poskim, we should end with Baruch Atah Hashem, Kel Rov Hodos. And we don't repeat the word Hodos a second time. And this leads us to a whole string of Aggadic statements about the greatness of rain and the comparison between rain and Tchias HaMesim, Omer Rabbi Avo, on the top of Daf Zayin, Omer Al. Thank you very much. And tomorrow we'll do Daf Zayin.